Okay, hello everyone. Thank you for joining the Wolf Conservation Center for our informative webinar about communities and conservation. My name is Regan Downey, and I'm the Director of Education at the Wolf Conservation Center, and I'll be moderating tonight's program along with Dr. Joey Hinton, the Wolf Center's Senior Research Scientist. For anyone who's unfamiliar, the Wolf Conservation Center works to advance the survival of wolves by inspiring a global community through education, advocacy, research, and recovery, and we're funded entirely by people like you. So thank you. Our scientific webinar series allows us to bridge the gap between research and the general public, which allows for engaging discussions and increased advocacy. We're so excited to welcome Dr. Aby Sène-Harper. Dr. Aby Sène-Harper is a faculty member in Parks and Conservation Area Management at Clemson University in South Carolina. Dr. Sène-Harper is a trained interdisciplinary environmental social scientist committed to advancing socially and ecologically just approaches to managing public lands, natural resources, and cultural heritage in both the US and Africa. Before we begin, I'd like to point out a few housekeeping tips. You can use two Zoom features to communicate with us. You can use the chat feature for general commentary and the Q&A box for questions. We'll have a designated Q&A at the end of the webinar. If you would like a question to be answered during the program, you must type it into the Q&A box. This webinar is also being recorded and will be available for viewing on the Wolf Center's YouTube channel within the next week. With that, Dr. Sène-Harper, take it away.
Thank you so much for that introduction, Reagan. Hi, everyone. I'm very excited to be here, and I just want to thank the Wolf Conservation Center for inviting me to this very important conversation, and I look forward to the discussion during the Q&A. And so what I'm going to present to you all today is about my research in general. Most of my work until maybe a few years ago, has taken place in Africa, and I'm just now recently doing some work in South Carolina, specifically with African American communities around conservation areas and parks and protected areas. But much of my work is still very much rooted in Africa, particularly in West Africa. I'm from Senegal, but I have lived in the US for 20 years now. And so what I'm going to present to you all is just a broad view of some of my research questions, right? The theoretical framework that I've been using to really understand what is at the root of the relationship between communities in Africa and conservation research and researchers and practitioners too. And so really looking at the history of that relationship and how that history of that relationship continues to guide community-based conservation projects, but also participatory schemes in conservation programs in Africa. But if you guys, if you have more questions regarding my work in South Carolina, please feel free to ask those questions as well during the Q&A. But for now, much of what I'm going to present is about some of my work in Africa. So just giving you just a broad overview of some of my research interest is that I'm really trying to gain a much deeper understanding of the colonial structures of power in conservation in Africa, right? Like how our power relations between communities and conservation research and practice in Africa continue to be much embedded into these neo-colonial structures, but also rooted in colonialism and also imperialism in its newest form. And I'm also interested in understanding how can we understanding the values and socio-economic processes of local communities, and then how to integrate those into the governance of parks and protected areas management in Africa, but also in the United States. There has been a lot of increasing interest now in engaging with people from conservation. Sorry, a lot of interest from conservation research and practice to engage with people, and also drawing from social sciences to improve environmental governance. And so in doing so, conservation over the years has engaged with power in many ways, either explicitly or implicitly. And so my question is, how do we account for power and coloniality in participatory conservation schemes? And I usually use a political ecology and a post-colonial theory framework or lens to understand some of those power structures. And so what is a political theory, right? I'm sorry, political ecology. Political ecology really is preoccupied with understanding how and why economic structures and power relations drive environmental change and shape conservation planning, historically and also today. And there is this very helpful figure that I got from a paper called Navigating Power in Conservation by Shackleton and colleagues, who is really has the 4 elements of power, the 4 dimensions of power, and that explains what kinds of power exist in order to understand and unpack those power relations. And much of what my work is really looking at both discursive power, but also structural power, right? And so what does discursive power mean? Is that power is constitutive of all social relations and individual subjectivities, and it is exercised through the mobilization of certain knowledge, dominant ideas, discourses, and narratives, right, to govern people and spaces by shaping human and non-human behavior, right? And so this discursive power is really what kind of discourses are wielded by government actors, but also external actors. What kind of discourses are wielded in order to shape the subjectivities of local communities, but also ultimately shape the outcomes of these conservation programs? And discursive power, when we talk about discursive power, it is often applied to study how conservation sciences discourses and decisions about nature and wilderness, gender, or race frame some people as poachers or hunters, for example, or as environmental destroyers or stewards, right? It is also used to study how conservation science and practice make some species live, whereas others are to let die, and whose values and views these decisions reflect, right? So as you'll notice later, a lot of my interest is around discursive power, but I'm also interested in structural power, especially if I am looking at neo-colonial structures, right? Imperialist structures, then we're talking about structural power, which means that power is imprinted in political and economic structures and class relations, which are socially produced but not vested in individual actors or institutions. This manifests in uneven distribution and access to material and symbolic resources. So it is often applied to study colonial legacies of conservation, the role of the state in reproducing class relations, and political economic structures of capital accumulation and dispossession. And so a lot of this information that I have just given you is included in this paper that I have the reference for in here. So much of it are quotes that I pull from that paper. And I also use a post-colonial theory framework. And so in post-colonial theory are much preoccupied with the cultural, political, and economic legacy of colonialism and imperialism. And it is also concerned with the ongoing exploitation of colonized people and their lands. And this book that I have put up here is actually one of those seminal pieces by Edward Said in the post-colonial theory body of knowledge. And Edward Said was a Palestinian post-colonial theories, who was very, very influential in his work on post-colonial theory, but even beyond in understanding political economic structures, but also discursive power today. And so Edward Said contends that imperialism and colonialism are supported and impelled by impressive ideological formations, further noting that these ideologies include concepts and values that cement systems of domination essential to maintain the colonial order. And so if we were to talk about these impressive ideological formations that are cementing domination in conservation today, particularly in Africa, right? What are those concepts? What are those values embedded in conservation research and practice, right, that continue to maintain those systems of domination? And so political ecologists have also used post-colonial theories, right? And they have written extensively on, for example, what we call the racialized geopolitics of protected areas. They argue that global conservation is biopolitical in that the ideas and practices are rooted in technologies of power to manage human and non-human life. Furthermore, it is anchored in forms of environment that aligns ecological rationalities and technologies of governance to produce ideas of the environment transmitted through the international state system. And the quote that I just read to you is from Ramotse Tela et al., who have written an excellent book that I reviewed not too long ago called The Violence of Conservation in Africa, in really trying to understand the coloniality of power in conservation, but also how these technologies of governance and these ecological rationalities are often wielded against African communities. And so some of the guiding questions that I have today with my work is to understand what is the historical colonial imperialist relationship between conservation actors, that means conservation NGOs, even states, right? Governments, local governments as well, but also international bodies like the IUCN, the UNDP, and so on and so forth, right? What is that historical colonial relationship between conservation actors and indigenous communities in Africa? And how was the community discursively constructed in conservation research and practice? How does that relationship continue to shape today's participatory schemes in conservation planning? And so there is a paper that I'm currently working on that is actually looking at the making of the other in conservation laws, right? So in line with political ecologists and post-colonial theorists, is that my thesis is that conservation involves the co-construction of race and nature, right? And by co-construction of race, what I mean is the construction of the racialized other, that is the indigenous community, or even in the case of the United States, where you do have indigenous communities, but you also have African-American communities who are considered a racialized people, right? And through that racialization process, there are very different ways in which conservation policies affect and impact their relationship to the land and those resources. And so the place of the indigenous in the enclosure of conservation, that is protected areas, or the enclosure of that wilderness, is a question that embodies the co-production of race and space, right? The co-production of race and nature. So the, conservation researchers and practitioners historically have always been preoccupied with what should be the place, right, of the indigenous person or the indigenous communities within conservation practice. And so I propose that wilderness, right, or conservation is not only embedded in the racialized politics that is foundational to colonialism and capitalism, but also conservation discourses, and continue to ascribe and circumscribe the indigenous identity. That means that the ways in which conservation practice is practiced today, particularly in Africa, is still very much rooted in the colonial question of what should we do, what to do with the indigenous communities, what should we do with the indigenous person and his or her community, right? It's still very much rooted in those colonial questions. But also even today, it continues to circumscribe, the identity of indigenous communities. And so what I'm going to do now is walk you through a little bit of those laws and how that question was answered during the colonial era, and then how those ones are continued to be transcribed or transported to today. And so, of course, we have to talk about the British game laws that was exported into the British colonies, right? There is often the idea that conservation in Africa really started right after Yellowstone National Park, or the model of Yellowstone was exported in Africa, but it was actually well before that, right, by the export of game laws in the British colonies. And this is something that both Perelman and Giltner, but also even Roderick Newman, who are prominent political ecologists, have written extensively on to document how game laws were actually used to position the indigenous person, the indigenous communities, as a threat, right? So the indigenous community was either seen as a threat or as a noble savage, right? But the British game laws were often invoked and instituted by positioning indigenous communities as a threat to their natural environment. And really quickly, the British game laws were instituted, at least the Game Law Act, or the British Game Act, was instituted, I think, in the 1860s to protect, or through the claim of protecting birds in a way, right? But also wild birds and also wildlife against subsistence hunters. There was the idea that subsistence hunters at the time were the one who were posing a threat to the survival of bird life in Great Britain. And so the game laws was instituted to take away their rights to hunt. But in South Africa, when that was exported, it was also a law that was used to criminalize subsistence African hunters, not just for that, but also to force them into wage labor, right? So indigenous communities in relationship to conservation became a threat, right, to wildlife, but also they became a labor pool, right? Conservation was used, and involved the conservation laws was used not only to criminalize and cut their ability to sustain themselves, but also to thrust them into a capitalist system where they became a labor pool as well. So it had that dual, had that dual purpose, right? Even in the US, this excellent book by Giltner, Hunting and Fishing in the New South, Black Labor and White Leisure After the Civil War, also documents really well how US game laws used to undermine the freedom of African Americans during the Reconstruction era, right? Again, to thrust them not just to cut their ability to be self-sustaining communities, but also to keep them into a low-wage labor pool. And this was very interesting, the kind of language that they were using. This is from an editorial that was taken from Louisiana Sport, a hunting sport club sport hunting club in Louisiana, one of the club members had written to the newspaper, and it made it to the editorial, which concluded that African Americans, unlike white sportsmen, killed anything they encountered, whatever its age or species. The writer's solution to this problem was to strengthen fish and game laws in order to prevent the complete annihilation by the Negroes and their dog, or everything that can be styled game. And so this kind of language is often used, still continued to be evoked, particularly in Africa, where we often hear how Africans continue to be a threat to wildlife preservation in Africa. I mean, and I'll talk a little bit more about it. And so there was the question, going back to my original question of what is the place of the making of the other, the indigenous communities. They were either seen as a threat to wildlife or as a noble savage, and in which case, if they were deemed as a noble savage, what should be the place of the indigenous in conservation or within protected areas? And Roderick Newman, another political ecologist who's written an excellent book called Imposing Wilderness, Struggle Over Livelihood and Nature Preservation in Africa, talked about the making of Serengeti Park and how the colonial state imposed notion of who was and who was not a Maasai, who had customary residence within the park, that produced very different landscape. And so the making of the Maasai identity in this case stemmed from the ideological current that romanticized the pre-European African society, which included notions of the noble savage, right? And so if the African was not deemed a threat, they were deemed as a noble savage, but it was within very, very tight boundaries in terms of the kinds of activities they could keep carrying, but also they were seen as part of the landscape. And so to be whose culture, a community whose culture could be commodified alongside nature, right? Alongside this protected area. And this is actually this also had resonance in what was previously happening in the U.S. settler colony, right, where there was debate around what to do with the Indian and protected areas, right? The making of the national park of the U.S. in the United States, it was very well documented. The question around the place of the Indian within wilderness was very well documented. And here there is I pulled this from an excellent book, Dispossessing the Wilderness, Indian Removal and the Making of the National Park by Mark Spence, who has taken part of the quote from George Catlin in some of his writing, who was a very famous painter, who describe what should be the place of the Indian within the national parks, right? So Catlin proposed that some great protecting policy of government preserve a large expanse of land in all its pristine beauty and wilderness and wildness. The world could see for ages to come the native Indian in his classic attire, galloping his horse amid the fleeting herds of elks and buffaloes. Such as magnificent area, he exclaimed, would be a nation park containing man and beast in all the wild and freshness of a nature's beauty. And so these are really some of the discourses under which that I contend still continue to shape our relationship, of conservation research and practice relationship with communities, right? And especially so in Africa. And so how does this colonial othering of communities continue to shape conservation today? Well, first, there's a very, very well documented reports on the ongoing violence of conservation in Africa, right? Especially through the evoking this sense of urgency, but also vilifying Africans, particularly African poachers, right? But not just poachers, but also even subsistence hunters. And so also community-based conservation in Africa continue to be mostly for the benefit of the elite class, right? Through tourism participation. And so the place of the community in conservation continues to be defined for them, even when they have land rights. And all of this has very well been documented. And I can give you a few examples. There is this book by Keith Somerville called Ivory, The Power and Poaching in Africa, who does a really excellent job in tracing, how ivory poaching is the underpinning of power relations and power structures in the ivory trade in Africa from pre-colonial to today, right? Contemporary days to modern day, but also showing that game laws was at the root of the criminalization of African hunters, but also privileging the elite class, particularly trophy hunters, right? And so game law still continues to inform some of those conservation policies. And so there's the ongoing marginalization of African hunters. And then there are also anti-Black rhetorical devices using slogans like African Chainsaw Massacre and statements like every African is a poacher. These were actually words that were used by wildlife authorities, but also under the auspices of international conservation agencies like the World Wildlife Fund, WWF, the Wildlife Conservation Society, African Wildlife Society, and so on and so forth, right? They have used those terms to sort of galvanize, right, public concerns, but also criminalize African subsistence hunters. And so reports also shows that 2/3 of conservation funding, international conservation funding, actually goes to law enforcement, right? And law enforcement, we're not just talking about park rangers, we are also talking about it is funding military artillery, right? The rise in militarized conservation has also been very, very well documented in Africa, but also that it has had negative impact on wildlife as well and local communities because of retaliation. So it's opening a host of issues that are counterproductive to what it had intended to do, right? So the rise in militarized conservation, again, are using these discursive colonial tropes that are always often used to vilify Africans in order to increase militarized conservation in Africa. And another book that I will highly recommend is The Violence of Conservation in Africa, right? Where it's a collection of case studies all throughout Africa, from West Africa to Southern and Eastern Africa, of different showing the ways in which this discursive power is again and again wielded against African communities. And so Ramutsele and his colleagues theorized that in nature conservation, right, dehumanization takes place through the category of the subhuman, through which they are treated like animals and that do not make it to the tables of conservation priorities. And this is still ongoing today. We argue that this dehumanization is a condition that makes violence against Blacks a permanent feature of conservation on the continent. Conservation creates white spaces from which Black bodies are expelled and controlled through violence. And so this is a picture that I took from Reuters News of women rangers in Zimbabwe, right? Oftentimes when we talk about engaging with local communities in Africa, in conservation, It's often through employment, but some of these employments are through military ranks, right? Like they are taken position as park rangers, and then often putting them again in conflictual relationship with these the communities from which they also were born and raised and all that. And so Newman asserts that the new community-oriented initiatives that have proliferated in Africa are integrated forms of social control designed to meet the needs and goals of international conservation organization and the tourism industry, noting that coercion and violence are not replaced by community participation, but continue as ever-present threats that influence the behavior and decision-making of local community members. And so in more recent years, when indigenous communities made land claims and land was given back to them, right, the old question of who was indigenous to the land and who had customary rights to the land often came up, right? And so this was the case in the Kalahari Desert, with the San people of Namibia. And Coot and her colleagues found that the San embraced the commodification of their culture in order to hold on to their lands, right? So they had to enact the tropes, the indigenous trope of what it meant to be a San, right? The Simon description of indigeneity that we often see in conservation, right? They had to enact it, but also they were forced to commodify their culture in order to be able to get some of those lands back, but also even holding on to their land, right? This was also the case with the Maasai and other cultural groups, where the indigenous people have actively responded and tried to benefit from what appeared as the inevitable, infusing capitalist values into their own culture. So that was, again, conservation or agenda or conservation movement way of ascribing what it meant to be a San, what it meant to be a Maasai, right? To be able to commodify that culture in ways that sort of fit the conservation agenda. Again, the co-production of these communities, these racialized communities and wilderness, the African wilderness. And so now we're going to move from the coloniality of conservation, right? How do we move beyond the coloniality of conservation to centering communities' needs in conservation? And so I want to give you a quick presentation on the research that I have done in West Africa. And this is one of the papers that came out of it. It was published in 2019. There are actually two other papers from the same research. But this was done in West Africa in the Transboundary Biosphere Reserve of the Senegal River Delta, which included two national parks, Djoudj National Park, which is in Senegal, and Joli National Park in Mauritania, right? And these two parks have very, very different governance model. The one in Senegal was still using the same colonial framework of top-down, very militarized approach that was very exclusionary, right? And also when land claims were, the communities were evicted in 1971, and so in order for them to benefit from conservation, they were given ecotourism. That was the only way they were able to benefit from conservation project, but also getting some of those resources back that they were trying to reclaim. Joli National Park had a very, very different strategy where the communities were not evicted. So you still have communities living inside the park, but tourism was not something, it was brought to the table, but they were more so focused on the local needs. And so my question was how trying to compare those two models and see which one had much more effective, which one had more positive outcomes, both for conservation and for livelihoods as well, and also looking at the community and park relationship. So just to give you a quick overview of their management plans, right? So the management regime, as I had talked about earlier, the government manages exclusively the park in Senegal, and there are no community rights to access those resources, and there was limited participation of local communities, right? And so that limited participation, as I said earlier, was mostly focused on ecotourism. Ecotourism was the only way they could benefit from it. Joling, on the other hand, is a co-management system between the governments and the local communities. And so the communities have concession rights to fishing resources. Again, these are wetlands, right? It's in the Senegal River Delta, so most of the park are wetlands, and it's one of the most important ornithological sites in Africa. And so those communities that were evicted or left in the park, in the case of Joling, were mostly fishing communities, fishing and farming communities. And the communities also participated in resource monitoring, right? Like they were actively participating with the park guards, or not the park guards, but the park director and the ecologist on site to monitor resource use within the park, but also within the water bodies that were feeding into the park. So the role of local institutions, a judge, you had a paramilitary park officials, again, this very militarized form of conservation. And then you also had the eco guards who serve as the liaison between the park and communities, but they were mostly involved in volunteer in awareness campaigns. And the eco guards were actually trained volunteers from each of those communities that surrounded the park, that acted as a liaison between the community and the park. On the other hand, it was in Joling, it's a very shared responsibility approach that they have, right? So it's a shared responsibility of resource management and the monitoring the monitoring and technical support was given to local communities by the park. They also had a fisherman cooperative, right? So their focal point was mostly on the fisherman cooperative instead of forming an entire new community-based organization like the Eco Guards in Senegal. They actually worked from the institutions that were already in place, from the organizations that were already in place, right? They did not impose, or they did not bring in a new community-based organization. They just worked from the ones that already existed. And so the fishermen cooperative had a shared responsibility of resource management and monitoring, and to support the livelihood diversification of those households. So what Joling did is try to understand what are some of those livelihood strategies at the local level within those communities, within those household that already had what we call a conservation ethos, right, within their livelihood practices. So for example, the seasonal uptake of agriculture was actually something they were doing during the low fishing season, right, to ensure that the fishery resources were replenishing. And so they were reinforcing their agricultural activities during that time instead of completely cutting off access to fishing. And so some of these activities in the communities were tourism-based occupations in Senegal, and I was saying earlier, Joling, on the other hand, is enhancing those pre-existing fishing, farming, mixed livelihood system. And so some of the key findings that I have is that community-based conservation that are focused on pre-existing livelihood strategies can be an effective at enhancing local livelihoods and fostering positive conservation behaviors. Some of the critical success factors was that governance regime that fosters a sense of resource ownership among local people instead of the constant marginalization actually had a positive impact on positive conservation impact, right? But also it was the adherence to local needs and priorities within the vulnerability context of those local communities, right? One thing that I forgot to mention is that ecotourism is a very seasonal activity, right? And so you're making communities dependent on ecotourism, right? In Senegal, when ecotourism the season was closed, they had nothing else. They would go back in the park. It was mostly it had the reverse effect, right? And then the ecotourism actually corresponded with the high fishing season. So in the end, fishermen prefer not to be involved in ecotourism because it was taking their income away from conservation. I'm sorry, from fishing. And so it actually did not have the impact that they needed, that they were looking for at the community level. And so in place where tourism has not succeeded in delivering positive conservation and development goals, my study presents like an alternative strategy that is rooted in the social and environmental realities of local communities. And so much of what I was trying to do with this study is to break away with the notion or the colonial trope that indigenous communities in Africa were actually a threat to conservation, to wildlife conservation because of their livelihood practices. And so I found this case in Senegal and try to compare the two, Senegal and Mauritania, to counter some of those colonial narratives that continue to inform a host of conservation practice in Africa. And yeah, that's it. Thank you very much. I'm ready for questions.
Thank you, Aby. Appreciate you giving that presentation. Yeah, so I'll give you a minute to rest your voice, if you don't mind.
Sure.
I'll give our listeners just a heads up. One of the things we're doing here at the Wolf Conservation Center is incorporating more social ecological like research into our program. And so we've been concerned about these socio-economic questions too, which is one of the reasons why we asked Aby to come on and give a presentation, because some of these topics she discussed is where we're going to start moving into in terms of our research when we reach out to communities. We don't want to go into these communities and sort of say this is what's up and this is how things should be done. Instead, we want to use a community-based approach where we figure out what their needs are and then see how the Wolf Conservation Center can sort of assist and improving their quality of life there using, our research and resource capacities and whatnot. And so with that, I'll just start off asking some questions, and as they roll in, I'll relay them back to Aby. So, when you first opened up, you mentioned about imperialism and colonialism, and I didn't know if there is any like strict definition that differentiates the two. How would somebody know what's imperialistic versus what's colonial?
Yeah, so imperialism is very much so it's mostly focused on the control of foreign governments through policies, laws, and so on and so forth. Colonial, on the other hand, is much more direct infringement on the sovereignty, right? So imperialism, I would say, is really a higher stage of colonialism where you have, it's a lot more removed as well than colonialism, right? And if you look at when we talk about imperialist policies, when we talk about imperialist institutions, for example, like IUCN in a sense is regarded as an imperialist institution because it is serving the needs of European countries, right? The European Green Agenda and also the US Green Agenda, but also controlling local, controlling through its policies and its program, the conservation agenda in Africa, right, in a sense. And so it's more of an indirect control over the sovereignty of African states, in a sense, right? And so when Edward Said talked about imperialism as a very discursive practice, what are some of these, in a sense, discourses around environment, around nature, around race that are used to normalize imperialist policies in a way, if that makes sense. Colonial is a much more direct form. Like, think about settler colonialism, for example, right? It's a much more direct form of sovereign of occupation, but also of control of governments and also local communities. And I hope that that answers your question. Yeah.
For me, it does. Yeah, it makes sense. In that, I mean, I could envision. Yeah, so like with the British, I mean, they could be imperialistic, but once they have settlers on the ground, I guess it's a matter of scale, I guess.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. And I think now, it would be more correct to talk about there are neo-colonial structures, right? We talk about neo-colonial structures in Africa, which is also really, again, a much more, it's embedded within an imperialist structures, right? This is why I use more so imperialism than colonialism, because oftentimes when you say colonialism in Africa, they say, oh, that doesn't exist anymore, right? Like, Africans are not independent states, which is not necessarily the case, because our sovereignty, our political choices, economic choices, even the green agenda, right? The environmental programs in Africa are still very much dictated by imperialist institutions in the global north.
Excellent. Thanks. Yeah, because thinking about our game laws, which you had mentioned, I'm glad you brought up the I think it was the Gittner book, because I have that and we've been diving into it. It's been a really good resource in learning.
Which one is that? I'm sorry. What book?
The Gittner book that you referenced.
Oh, yes.
Yeah. I've got that, and we've been using it too. Regarding game laws here in the U.S., particularly in the South, because, as you know, shortly after African slaves were emancipated, game laws started popping up in predominantly Black counties throughout the South. Mm-hmm. And the point was to remove autonomy from them, because they meant more to the plantation class than the plantation class meant to the freed enslaved Black folks. And so the way to force them back into the cotton fields was to take away their autonomy. Since Black communities knew how to hunt, they knew how to fish, they could sell these animals on the market and make cash and grow their own crops and whatnot. They were independent. And so they had to find a way to take that autonomy away from them. And our first game laws were to do exactly that. And so, and then unfortunately it wound up being used elsewhere, as you mentioned, to force not just Black folks into the fields again, but also force poor whites and other groups into the market. Because, like, you can't go on your own, so you have to go work for somebody and force them into doing that stuff. And I don't think people realize, like, how integrated all that stuff is with class and race and whatnot.
Yes. And so I think, really understanding even conservation as serving the capitalism, right? The expansion of capitalism. Understanding how game laws function and how it was exported, even in Great Britain, right? Like, game laws were also instituted as a way to force local, the peasant class in Europe, in Britain, into a capitalist system where they became laborers, right? And so game laws have, in order to really understand how conservation has been used to serve the expansion of capitalism, game laws have really been key, to understand how it functioned. It's important to study, game laws, the application of game laws in Great Britain, in the US, right, during the Reconstruction era, as you mentioned, Joey, but also even in Africa, well before the first protected areas were established in Africa. There were game laws that were established in Africa for, to take away that sense of autonomy and then force indigenous communities into into labor relations with the settlers.
I got one question here. I have somebody asking about relating this to how conservation organizations can begin to reflect upon like their own practices, how to implement change internally and externally. If that question makes sense.
No, okay, no, I think it does, but can you repeat it, please?
Yeah,
Just
so
so that I
basically,
can think through it. Yeah.
yeah, I'm assuming just in conservation organizations, basically the nonprofit world, how can we, begin to reflect upon our own practices and how to implement change internally and externally. I guess, how do you decolonize nonprofit stuff? You know what I mean?
Yeah, and I think, decolonizing to me is not, there's I don't necessarily use decolonize only because if there is no talk around land rights, then you're not decolonizing in a sense, right? You are merely just trying to have a more inclusive framework, right? Because decolonization has always been about land, right? Like how around land rights, but you can talk about anti-colonialism, right? Like how do you actually practice anti-colonial processes or praxis or decolonial praxis in conservation? And so in reflecting in that it's again, it may sound cliche, but really understanding, departing from the communities, right? Like what are their needs rather than coming in with how you have always been trained. And I had to make that shift myself, right? Like when I went to Senegal, the reason why I even took on that Mauritania, case was because I started in Senegal trying to study the impact of ecotourism. Because it was the IUCN project, and that's what I was going to do, monitoring and evaluation and give them recommendation. But it was the sense to me to say, how do we fix ecotourism so that it can work for everyone when half of the population did not want ecotourism, right? Like they made it clear. And so I had to change that question, right? Like how, and it's the same with African-American communities that I'm working with now, right? At the Francis Marion National Forest, but also Congaree National Forest. It has always been around how do we make African Americans interact with these national parks or participate in outdoor recreation, right? Like how do we have a more inclusive space, but within this very Eurocentric framework of what it even means to be in relationship with the land, right? Rather than asking them what is their worldviews around land relationship, right? Like, do you need to have an in situ experience in order to even feel connected to the land, right? And so part of the reflection that internally that organizations need to make is to go back at all of these concepts that they're using to analyze some of these issues. Like, look around what we mean by, for example, outdoor recreation, right? Like, and I talk about it because I work a lot with outdoor recreation planners because they're hiring. I mean, they're giving me contracts to study how to, make outdoor recreation more inclusive to African Americans. But like, what does even recreation mean to African Americans, right? And it's the same with communities in Africa, right? Like, we have bought into this notion that the only way they can conserve wildlife is if they can benefit economically, when it's so much more than economic benefits to them, right? Like there's an entire relationship to the land that they have that also needs to be considered. And so the part of the internal reflection that organizations need to do is to understand those underpinning logic, right? That logic that we always tend to use in order to either conduct research or also develop programs for marginalized communities. Sorry, I know that was a long-winded answer, but I hope it's clear. Yeah.
No, I did. Yeah, it's really helpful. So we have another question here. I'll read it slowly. What can we do to encourage and support more community-based conservation, given the force, drive, and greed that drive the world economy or economies. They emphasize the word greed. How and where do we put some balance protecting people and environments?
Okay, how and where do we begin to put some balance?
Can you see them?
Yeah, I can.
There you go. I'll see you're reading a question.
Yeah, I have a very basic sort of answer to that. Because so much of conservation now is again linked to capitalist framework. We've talked, we've looked at, for example, how tourism, for example, is always has been used as a mode to encourage and support community-based conservation, but it's still a very capitalist framework, right? And so how do we dislodge this capitalist framework and really understand how local communities want to preserve their land, right? Because again, the reason why these areas are targeted for conservation is because they have used, their indigenous technologies, their indigenous knowledge to preserve that land. And so to me is how do you balance to protect people in an environment is to understand how fundamental land rights is to preserving that land. I mean, we've seen it, for example, recently with the recent ruling, I think it was in Ecuador, where communities were given by the state, the Supreme Court, indigenous communities outside of a park won a court claim. And so the court recognized their communal land rights, and they have used that communal land rights in order to fight extractive industries, right? The first thing that they did once they had that their land rights was recognized was to fight petroleum, gas drilling, gas exploration within that national park. And so there is a direct link between community land ownership, again, like I was saying, right, community ownership of resources and fighting, some of these extractive industries that we're seeing are very predatory to wildlife and natural resources in general.
So you can see these. So I'll read them because they are.
Yeah, that's fine.
Read them, but this one's pretty simple. They're saying great book reference in the book's reference in your talk. The violence of conservation in Africa costs $140. I don't think I'll find this in my local library. Any ideas? Great presentation and research.
Thank you. Yeah, I can actually. I do have the first. I have the first chapter that's available. I know they're quite pricey. That's another. The bane of my existence with academic resources. But I can also share, Lori, I did a book review for that. I wrote a review for that book that I can share with you. And also I'm happy to share at least the first chapter of that book, which is available for free, I think. But I have it downloaded and I can send that to Joey. I mean, I'm not sure how we can have that sent to you, but I'll be happy to do that, to share those resources with you.
Yeah, once we get it, we can figure something out, whether it's linking it into the YouTube recording of this, or I mean, we can figure it out.
Yeah.
This other question here from Deborah. This was so enlightening and helpful in how I think about our conservation in America and how I view conservation efforts throughout the world. I truly think that many non-Indigenous people have no idea that although they mean well, there is another very different perspective that should be considered when thinking about their own ecotourism and or donations made to nonprofits. What do you hope will change in conservation as practiced today, given your work?
Yeah, I think there's actually, and not just because of my work, but there's actually it's almost like people are becoming more aware of some of these issues that you brought up, Deborah. And that also stemmed from how much I've been, I've had so many commissioned pieces to write about the conservation issues in Africa that actually tackle specifically some of those issues. How, for example, ecotourism projects have had negative impact on wildlife, right? But also wildlife and communities, debunking a lot of those myths that we've had. And so I'm hopeful, but unfortunately, I think that with the urgency, the ecological crisis that we are going through right now, that has also opened the door with much more predatory practices, right? Like I'm thinking about biodiversity offset projects. I'm thinking about carbon offset projects where we're saying, we're so consumed in trying to find a quick solution to this, right, that it actually has the reverse effect, right? As biodiversity offset projects, by the way, is you plunder nature on one side, kill all the biodiversity, but then you're going to offset it by setting aside land somewhere else to preserve. But that also results in dispossession, community dispossession. And so you continue the plunder of nature here, but then somewhere else you can, as long as you can preserve it somewhere else, right? And so while there is an awareness in some of these, the negative impact of tourism, but also other of these community-based schemes, there's equally the urgency of this ecological crisis that is also opening the door for more predatory practice. I always tell people to keep a laser focus on local communities because they are the one who are living the consequences of wildlife conservation, but also are in direct relationship with wildlife on the ground. And so while there's all of this happening, my focus is why I'm always focusing on local communities, and also just bring more awareness to some of these predatory practices, but also pushing for more legislation to give land rights to indigenous communities.
All right. Yeah, we're getting close to the hour mark. Well, actually, we're over it a little bit. I did want
yeah.
want to sort of bug you a little bit about some of the wolf stuff, and
okay.
you don't mind before we let you go. So
sure.
From my perspective, and our perspective at the Wolf Center doing this stuff, a lot of the advocacy groups and researchers and just the community in general is particularly white. There's not a whole lot of diversity to it. But even so, when we do, sort of try to work with communities, particularly like the Red Wolf in the Southeast, many of these communities are diverse. The landowner class is not diverse, it's predominantly white, but the community is diverse.
Yes.
And trying to reach out and work with the Black communities in and around these like in North Carolina, and getting them included with the Red Wolf Conservation, get them at the table in terms of getting their communities involved with recovery efforts, and then finding future reintroduction sites that could be even further deeper in the South, where you have very predominant Black communities that may be where these animals may be released in the future. So when you work with the landowner class, a lot of times sometimes the wolves are very symbolic. Sometimes they're not angry at the wolf; they're angry at something else.
You
have those conflations of different issues and those histories. But once you start incorporating other communities into that, like Black Americans are going to have a different distrust of the government than say white landowners are. Yeah. And I don't say it's a complex issue, because when you actually take in consideration the history and everything, it becomes sophisticated. It's simpler, but it's actually just more of a sophisticated problem than a complex problem. And so I didn't know if you speak to that. I know I rambled there a little bit, but
no, and that's fine, and it's the same issue that we're also, I mean, not specifically with the Red Wolf, right? But even in this is why I'm always so skeptical of conservation programs that seem to package a solution, right? Like the nature-based solutions, things that folks are talking about. It's again, you're packaging it, but like you say, there's so many layers to some of these issues, right? Again, like the land ownership for one, but the different class relations and so on and so forth. And so this is, why it's so important to understand some of these layers before you present these different conservation programs that are ultimately, if you don't understand that, right, really lodge your program embedded within some of that complexity, then it might fall short. Now, what people often tell me is like, well, Abby, you know, we have donations, we have to respond to the donors. Conservation programs are often finite, right? Like they end within, at least in Africa, I'm not quite sure here, but like they have a 5-year plan and timeline and so on and so forth. And so it's like, it's almost like they have to package it in a way that fits that timeline, but also responding to the donors, right? Like very specific objectives. And so the best, you know, what can be done is really trying to find, again, giving those communities ownership of what that program should be like, right? Like, how do you involve the community to even ensure longevity, so that when these tension points start coming up, especially on land ownership and other things, right, that communities are at least able to take ownership of those programs in the long run beyond the conservation program, and then resolve some of that issue. And that's what we're doing now with the at Francis Marion National Park. Is we're just at the beginning, the exploration phase, where we're just now trying to understand that history of land relations, right, around the national forest. So that whatever program, we haven't even talked about what kind of program we should be implementing or what kind of research we should be doing there, but just simply understanding what you're pointing out, Joe, is that history of land ownership and class ownership, but also how conservation policies also have over time complicated some of that relationship between the different classes as well. So, I mean, it's not a straight answer, but at least some reflection around how it's really time to think about conservation programs in much more sophisticated ways that take into account some of that history, but also more attuned to those complexities and really engaging local communities so that they can take ownership of those projects beyond the timeline.
Yeah, awesome. Yeah, thanks. Yeah, that's something that we've sort of struggled with regarding like talking about stakeholders. It's like, what do you mean by stakeholder? You know, and if you mean everybody, then technically you're talking about the community. And if you're talking about the community, like it's that discursive, I guess.
Yeah.
Plus
and who's the community, right?
Yeah, right. Yeah. And so, you know, just trying to figure out strategies to, you know, sort of advocate for wolf populations and to get them reestablished. And you are going up against the power structure, you know, which is usually the federal and state level, which is another reason why we should be really inclusive, because when you look at these historically excluded groups and how they've won victories in terms of civil rights and political rights, you go, well, they went up against them and they had big victories, that we need their strategies and start bringing the strategies into our sort of, you know, our ways of going about this.
Yeah. And you know, again, going back to what I was saying, it's almost like I'm sounding like a bit of box, but it's again having these communities involved every step of the way so that they can in turn advocate for themselves, right, for these policies at the local, state, and national level, right? Because you want them to be, you're not going to be there for you come in, you implement your project, and you go somewhere else, right? And so who's going to have ownership of some of these projects, if not local communities? And so the involvement of local communities, but also understanding within the communities who are those key, key people within the communities that can carry this on, but also keep the project going, is also something else that we probably should be thinking about as well.
All right, well, awesome. Well, I appreciate it, Abby. I don't want to keep you any longer, you know, going into the evening, back to your family. So I just want to say thanks.
Thank you.
Yeah. I don't know if Regan's still on, if there's anything else we need to let folks know before we cut out of here.
No, we are all set. Thank you so much to Dr. Sène-Harper for joining us, and thank you to everyone for watching. As mentioned earlier, we will be posting a recording of this on our website, and we will certainly try to incorporate any literature and supporting materials that are sent. We can have those linked on our website and in the YouTube description as well.